Hello, Cornerstone. Next week, we're going to be preaching on Romans 5:12 through 21, and Jared Bartholomew will be preaching. And it was, for me, somewhat of a difficult passage to understand. And so I think when we have that passage, it's good for us to kind of summarize the main ideas and the main idea of the context. So really, I believe the main idea of this passage is that what Christ has done for us by faith is far greater than what Adam did for all of us that are part of Adam. And really, for 5 chapters, I feel like Paul has been laboring to make it clear and compelling to us the truth that we as sinners are right with God, not on the basis of any inherent righteousness that's inside of us, but solely on the righteousness of Christ that is received by faith. And in this passage, it almost seems like Paul is saying that God saves us this way through Christ because it corresponds to the same way that we are condemned through Adam. And it doesn't come through us so much individually, but our sin doesn't come from us so much individually, but it comes from us as Adam, as our representative. And in the same way, our justification doesn't come from us individually, but comes through our connection in Christ. So I think what I'm going to do in my group is to start out with Genesis 3. And it really depends on your group, but if your group doesn't have a good understanding of how sin entered the world through Adam and the implications of that, then it's going to be difficult for you to work through this passage. And so we're going to start out with the reading of Genesis 3, and I'm going to ask a question. Okay, is death a natural part of life? Why or why not? And I think from a secular perspective, obviously all of us would say, well, death is absolutely a part of life. And so we have a common saying that the only 2 things that we can count on in this life is death and taxes. But we really see in this passage in 5:12, Paul says that sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. In this way, death spread to all men. And so death is not part of God's original plan. Death only entered the world through Adam's sin, and death will finally be conquered once and for all when Christ returns. And so I firmly believe in the way we view death will clearly have an impact on how we live. And if we believe that death is not part of how this life should be, it will have an impact on how we live today. And so then as we move on to the passage, the last half of verse 14 says, he and Adam is a prototype, interesting word, of the coming one. And so this idea that Adam is like Christ is an important one. He's a type. He's a prototype. He's a model. And so he's an example or a foreshadowing of Christ. And so really what Paul does throughout the rest of this passage is he contrasts this idea of Adam and Christ. And it seems like Paul believes that the more fully we see how sin entered the world through Adam, we can see the justifying work of how redemption entered the world through Christ. It helps us to understand those types of things. And in verses 15, 16, and 17, he shows us how Christ is not like Adam, and he contrasts these things. And so in verse 15, Paul seems to be saying that when you contrast these ideas of sin and righteousness, this gift and this trespass, righteousness wins. Righteousness is much more certain and powerful. And really, I think that idea is rooted in how we think about God. You know, God is not a God of judgment, but He's a God of reconciliation. He wants us not predominantly to judge us, but to bring us to Him as reconciled, as clean, as His children. Verse 16 emphasizes the same idea, is that this gift, this God's grace, it triumphs not only over Adam's sin, but every sin because of this righteousness of Christ. And so again, this idea of this contrasting this Adam's sin with Christ's righteousness. In verse 17, Paul seems to be saying that not only will we simply replace life, simply replace death with life, but that our inheritance is to reign forever. And so again, this idea of this preeminence of this righteousness of Christ is greater than the death that comes through Adam. As we move on through the passage in verse 18 and 19, Paul almost seems to be implying that Adam's sin condemned all mankind. And so if you want to in your group, you can get into the implications of that. So if Adam's sin, not so much my sin, but if Adam's sin condemned me, so what are some implications for our sin and our justification? And so really you can bring out the idea again is that justification happens to all those that are connected in Christ in the same way that condemnation happened to all those that are connected in Adam. Again, tying it to the bigger idea that we see throughout this passage is that our righteousness is based not so much on what we have done, but on what Christ did for us. And so really, I think that's an excellent place for you again to end up the study of this passage. And so our righteousness is not based on what we have done, but on what Christ did for us. And again, it's an excellent opportunity for us to preach that powerful gospel, the one that saves us from sin, that saves us from ourself and unrighteousness, and the powerfulness of this God's justifying faith for us.